All right, in this section, we're going to conclude our discussion on hemostasis by actually forming the clot. We already got the platelet plug done, and now we're going to bring in the fibrinogen to form the clot. So we're going to have you differentiate two different pathways to get there. There's an intrinsic pathway and an extrinsic pathway, and they're going to come together to form a common pathway, in which case we're going to use these enzymes. Prothrombin is going to make thrombin, which is going to activate fibrinogen to make fibrin. So we're going to look at that pathway as well. Okay, so just 4 slides here. First off, we've got that platelet plug that we already made, and you can see probably better right here. Here's that platelet plug with all of our little platelets, and I mentioned in the previous video that they're going to be sending out all of these activating factors. There's at least a dozen or so of them. I'm not going to make you memorize each of those activating factors, but I will want you to know a few of them. But more importantly at this point is that there's 2 pathways to get this thing going. There's what we call an intrinsic pathway and an extrinsic pathway. And the intrinsic pathway is basically recognizing that we've got all of these factors and things in our body, and your body can start making a clot at any time without having any kind of insult or injury. So if the blood gets pooled and static for too long, it's actually going to start to make a clot. And it can do that via this intrinsic pathway, which I'll show you on the next slide. The extrinsic pathway is specifically for injury, and it bypasses a lot of the steps of the intrinsic pathway, and it gets this thing clotting up really quickly. Basically, what's going to happen is whether you go the intrinsic or extrinsic pathway, you're going to end up making something called factor 10. And factor 10 is the start of this common pathway. And in that common pathway, what's going to happen is you're going to activate prothrombin, which is a proenzyme, so it means it needs to get activated. Factor 10 will activate prothrombin, and that's going to turn into thrombin. And the thrombin is going to be activated by calcium and phospholipids that this prothrombin is that's how it's turning into thrombin. So there's actually G proteins, and we're not going to get into this a whole lot. G proteins are going to bring calcium into that area, and that calcium is going to activate the prothrombin. Once the thrombin is active, and it is active by definition, that thrombin is going to come down here, and it's going to activate fibrinogen. Fibrinogen will then turn into fibrin, and that's what's going to make our clot. To make all of this happen, you're going to need vitamin K, and that vitamin K is produced in the liver. So let's take a look at this and just kind of see the big pathways. So I'm going to start by just talking about number 2 for a second. That's the intrinsic pathway. And this intrinsic pathway, I said, is always within us. We always have the ability to make clots, but that's mostly for stagnant blood, or when the blood is pooling. This can actually cause a clot. And this actually happens, and we saw a lot in the Iraqi and Afghanistan wars when we had our soldiers sitting in tanks for 12 or 15 hours at a time, and they're sitting in one position and they've got their knees bent and they're not moving, and the blood was starting to pool behind their knees, and this could actually make a clot. And that clot could be deadly, because if that clot breaks free, that can go to your lungs, and then all of a sudden you have what's called a pulmonary embolism, and you die because you can't breathe. So that's kind of a, not exaggerated, but an example of how this intrinsic pathway can cause a clot without having any injury or insult. And just recognize that there are a lot of stages in here. We've got like 12 or more different factors that are making enzymes that are activating this clotting pathway, and they don't go in order of number. They're numbered by how we actually scientifically observed them and found them. So you start with factor 12, then go to 11, then 9, whole bunch of things in between here. You end up with factor 10. And so that's the intrinsic pathway. The extrinsic pathway is when you have tissue injury. And so you think about it being extrinsic, something coming from the outside. When you have this tissue injury happen, you're going to skip a whole lot of steps. And you're going to start with this factor 7. And you notice that there's not this big, long, old cascade of things going on. There's just a few short steps to get you to factor 10. So whether you've gone the intrinsic pathway or the extrinsic pathway, you end up making factor 10. And factor 10 is going to be the start of this common pathway. And what happens with factor 10? Factor 10 is going to activate another factor, factor 5. You're going to be making calcium and phospholipids. And that calcium and phospholipid is going to activate something called prothrombin. So prothrombin, remember when we have pro, it's a precursor. So this prothrombin is going to end up getting turned into something called thrombin. And thrombin is going to come down and it's going to activate fibrinogen. Fibrinogen has been floating around in your bloodstream just waiting to get activated to start forming the clot. This fibrinogen then turns into fibrin. And fibrin is going to be our magic netting that's going to go out and start catching red blood cells and any other thing that's floating around in the blood to start making a net and a big plug. And we call that fibrin polymer. And this last factor here, factor 13, is what's taking that fibrin and making this fibrin polymer. So let's take that real quick. So here is all of these strands. This is our fibrin polymer. And you can see that they're just like a big, huge net that's out there, and they're catching red blood cells that are floating around, and that's going to cause things to back up and cause this big old fibrin plug, and that is your blood clot. So I mentioned earlier, a blood clot, when it's just stationed in one place, is called a thrombus. And a thrombus is going to, here we're seeing it in a vein, and we'll often see these called a deep, or when they're in a vein, we call that a deep venous thrombus. Deep venous thrombus. Or you've probably heard it called a DVT. And you can get a DVT. Often the example I gave you before was a DVT in that popliteal vein, which is right behind your knee in the popliteal region. If that DVT breaks free, it's going to flow through the veins. And remember, the veins go from small to larger. So that clot is going to be uninhibited, and it can travel up through that iliac vein, common iliac vein, the inferior vena cava, and it can go all the way into the heart through the inferior vena cava, and it's going to get pumped out directly to the lungs. And it's in the lungs where those vessels are going to start to get smaller. So if you get all these little blood clots breaking free, they're going to make it to the lung. And then if you can't get blood to the lung, because now you have a clot here, then you're not going to be able to exchange your gases. And that's what kills you. When a thrombus breaks free, it's called an emboli. So a thrombus is static, so it's in one place. But when it breaks free, it's called an embolus. It becomes an embolus, E-M-B-O-L-S. If you have many of them, which is often the case, you'll get what are called emboli. So pulmonary emboli are what are deadly. And again, you can get these, primarily we'll see these from the intrinsic pathway. So they could be forming and you don't even know it if you're getting pooling of blood in a certain area, and that's why that can be so dangerous. And that, I believe, concludes this section. Next, we're going to be looking at how we break up these clots and these emboli and some things that we can do about it medically.